Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. Okay, and what I want to do today is talk about not necessarily an introduction to making API calls or introduction to array methods. So if you wanted to learn about array methods, check out like my array methods video masterclass. That'll kind of show you how those work. And if you want to learn about how to make API calls, look up my videos on asynchronous JavaScript or on fetch or API calls. There's several videos on that topic that'll show you how to make API calls. Now, the purpose of this video is more to show you when you bring those together, how you get into a situation where you're doing sort of like things that you're going to want to do. Okay, so for example, here I have this dummy API data set I made, which just has some dummy data to practice making API calls. So for example, we will use this Pokedex information. So this Pokemon data right here. Okay, and this is JSON data. So you see like this file, this JSON file has all this data on Pokemon. So it's really just one big object. This big giant object has one property, Pokemon, and that property Pokemon is just a big array of objects, each object being one Pokemon. Okay, and notice how I have like the JSON looks pretty nice here. Like if you were to open this, and again the URL, if you want to go there, it'd be dummydata.netlify.app. So you can see like the list of different types of dummy data that I have. It probably won't look so pretty. What you're going to want to do is download an extension like Json Viewer. Okay, and there, well, you would want to type in like Chrome extension JSON Viewer, and you would install that, and that's going to allow you to kind of like see JSON data in a much more nicer format like this. Again, basic for you, it'll look something like this. Okay, if you were to just open up just with like a pristine Chrome browser. Okay, but this just makes it easier. I can like open up the different chunks of the objects. So I'm gonna say, hey, so you can see the object is really just an object with one property, Pokemon. But in that Pokemon property is an array, and then which is made up of several objects in that array. Okay, so if I were to go here, I could, close up all 150 objects because it's all the original 150 Pokemon and go from there. Okay, so generally when you are working with API data, this is generally the first step. The first step is actually look at the data, because how am I supposed to know that this is an object with a property called Pokemon? There's just no way for me to magically know that. So whenever you're working with an API, really the first thing to do is to go actually like take a look at what the API call does, see if you can see the data in their browser, explore the data, so that way you can get an idea of what the shape of the data looks like. What I mean by the shape of the data is like, am I getting back an object or am I getting back an array? What properties are in that object? What elements are in that array? Are there more nested items in there? Like what am I working with? Okay, but now I have an idea like what I'm getting. I know if I call this URL here, if I make a request, an API request for this URL, this is the data that I'm getting back. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create like a quick HTML file, just so that way I don't have to create like multiple files. So we'll just call this like API call .html. Do an HTML boilerplate. Do an exclamation point. Set up the boilerplate. I'm going to create a main an h1 list of Pokemon, because this is basically what we're going to do. We're going to have all the Pokemon get displayed on the screen by following this exercise. I'm going to create like a main tag, so that way we have somewhere to like render those Pokemon. So we'll use like DOM manipulation to kind of render those Pokemon there. Okay, so you see like, this is why all this JavaScript builds up to, being able to do this. And then I'm going to build a script tag so that we can write some JavaScript. Okay, that'll be our story here. Okay, now first thing I'm going to want to do is make my life easier. I'm going to create a variable to hold my URL. Okay, so the URL that I'm going to be like making my API call to. So I'm going to just copy this URL, put it into a string that I'm going to save in a variable called URL. Okay, why? Because this is the URL I'm going to make an API call to. But instead of having to type and copy and paste it every 5 seconds, I'll just have it saved here in a URL variable called URL to make it easy to use. Okay, now there's different ways I can make that API call. Okay, I could use the AJAX function as built into jQuery. I currently do not have jQuery loaded, so I'm not going to use that. You could use Axios, but then I'd also have to like import the Axios library, which is quite popular. But there is a way that's built into JavaScript. That's called fetch. Okay, so I'm going to use fetch. I'm going to make fetch happen. Okay, and fetch is pretty cool. Okay, Now, just a recap, like fetch, when you're making asynchronous API calls, so I am technically going to make a request to this website over here. This website's on some other computer far off in the internet somewhere. So there's no guarantee I'm going to get the data back in like a millisecond or instantaneously. It might take a millisecond, it might take several milliseconds, it might take a minute. So this is why JavaScript doesn't know when it's going to get the data. So this is generally why for any kind of asynchronous type of things where like the idea is that I need to be able to do multiple things at one time. I'm not going to stop my whole app because I have to wait for this API call to come through. So generally this is when we use promises. Okay, promises are a special type of object that represent data that I don't have yet. It's the promise of data to be received. Okay, and again, this is the cliff notes, so you can watch my videos on promises if you really want to get the full treatment on how promises work. So basically, we're going to say, hey, fetch is going to make an API call and take the data that we're expecting and save it in a promise. Now, once the data is actually inside that promise, or basically once that promise is finished, there are a couple different methods that are built into a promise object for me to express what I want to happen next. Okay, so that's essentially like the flow here. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, and to keep it simple, I'm going to save the promise inside of an object called request. So we're going to create a variable called request, and that's going to equal the result of doing a fetch, and the fetch is going to go to the URL. Okay, so I'm literally just saying, hey, go fetch whatever this URL gets me. Okay, the result is a promise object, and just to prove it to you, I'll console.log this request variable. Okay, fetch doesn't give me the data, it's going to give me this like promise object. So let's open this up in live server. So I'm going to open this up with live server. Okay, so here it is. Let's the Pokemon. So again, if I open this up in DevTools, okay, and I hit my console, so you see here's the promise. Okay, so there's the promise object. If I open it up, so you see there's a bunch of stuff in here. Okay, so I can see here like I can explore the prototype, and I can see like it has all these methods built in there. So .then and .finally and .catch is what we're going to care about in a second. I can see that this API call has been fulfilled, which means that the thing has happened. Okay, and then there's this like other object inside of it called the result of the promise. Okay, and then this is actually going to have the data in it. So like if I explore here, so here's the body, and if I open up the body, I can eventually find this readable stream. That's something we're going to have to then deal with. So that's why I can't. This object is not enough for me to get the data. The data is somewhere in this promise. That's the point. Okay, and another way I can kind of see that it happened is if I go to the network tab. Okay, if I refresh this page, so this network tab shows any time that the browser has to make a request for like a picture or for a font or for an HTML file, a CSS file, any request that happens, you'll see here. So if I refresh, see, we can see that first and initially the browser requested the HTML file and it received it. Okay, then that's some fake file that has to do with like live server. But then again, we made our request to for the Pokedex.json file. So I can see that request here, and I can see here this is the data that I got back. So I can see like, hey, look, it is getting back the data. Okay, but I need to access that data here in my JavaScript. So how do I do that? Okay, first step is, okay, we need to parse that readable stream. So I know that this is some promise object. Okay. In order for me to work with the data that is received, what I have to do is use a certain method called .then. Okay, so this promise object request .then represents what happens when you get the data. So it's like, and then you do this. Okay, so then I have to pass it a function, a callback. Okay, and this callback receives one argument, which is the thing that I got back. Okay, so in this case, this gets back the response. Okay. So now if I console log the response, okay, I can go back to the console and I can see, okay, hey, we have this response object. Okay. And see, it's a readable stream. The problem with the readable stream is that I can't actually, like, it's not like text I can use. It's a special type of object. Okay, so I can try to dig around in here and try to find the text, but it's really just a bunch of like, right now it's still just a bunch of bytes. So what we need to do is we need to get back the just to show you, like if I go to the prototype, so let me just take a look at the readable stream prototype. So let's just close all this. Here, the prototype of the response object. See, the prototype has a couple methods. We have a method called text that'll actually, so if I were to do like response.text, I think that's just going to give me another promise though. Yeah, see, that just gives me another promise. So that's not necessarily what I need yet. But essentially that would give me back the text. And if I wanted the JSON data, which is what I want, then there's another method inside of the response object called JSON. Okay, so what I want to do is return that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to return the result of response.json. So essentially this is going to take whatever the response is, take that readable stream, which is like a bunch of bytes, zeros and ones that were sent over from the other computer, my server that's running off somewhere, and it's going to return the JSON. So this dot then is essentially going to return another promise. Okay, so right now, essentially this is returning another promise that came from this function. So what I can then do is do another dot then off that dot then. Yes, that kind of reminds me of like that movie, Dude, Where's My Car, where they're at the, the drive-through, and it's like, and then. Well, this is generally how promises work. So just to kind of make it look a little prettier, I'm chaining these dot then. So again, the first dot then allows me to parse the readable stream. The second dot then, I have access to the data. Okay. So in the second dot then, I'm actually going to have access to the data. Okay, and again, these names are just arbitrary. It's just the way you traditionally use fetch is that in the first dot then you're getting back the response object, and then in the second dot then you're getting back the data, the payload, the JSON, whatever people want to call it. Okay, whatever variable is best for you. I like the word data because it's the data that I requested. So now if I console log this, the data, okay, see, there's the Pokemon. Okay, so see, it's an object with 150 Pokemon. Okay, so I got this data from a third party. Now the problem is, like, if I take a look at this, there's just a lot. If I go look and I go inside an array and I see like just in one Pokemon, there's like a lot of data. Okay, this would be a lot easier if I could have like an array of simpler objects. So instead of just like using this to generate stuff on the DOM, I'm going to create like a simpler array. Okay, that would make my life a lot easier. So what I'm going to do is we're going to say const simple version, meaning like a simpler array, is going to equal we're going to take the data and we're going to map it. And again, map, we have to use a function. So this is where the callbacks come into place. And we're going to take in the individual Pokemon. So we'll say Poke as the variable for that. And then what I'm going to want to do is return a simpler version of that object. Okay, so what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to examine, and this is why it's nice to have the console log of the data here, because I can then look at this and say, hey, what things do I want? Okay, so one individual Pokemon, a normal Pokemon, see, has all these properties. That's just like too much for me. Okay, so what I do want is I'm going to want the name property, so that'd be name, and that's going to equal poke.name. I'm just going to fetch all these properties that I would like. Do this one by one. Okay, so this part gets kind of tedious. Okay, keep it simple. We want the image because I want to get the picture of the, and that should be it. That should be good enough for now. Image, and that'd be poke.image. Okay, and there we go. So now, if I were the console log data.map, or I mean console.log simple version, okay. Data.map is not a very, oh, that's right, because it's not data, it's data.pokemon. Because again, data is an object. Inside of it, there's a property called Pokemon that has the array. So here we go. So see now, this console log, line 33, so again, that's this console log here where I'm console logging simple version. We can see here that these objects are much simpler. Okay, so these objects only have two properties. That's much easier for me to work with. Okay, I'm not having to think too hard. Okay, that's the beauty of map. I could take an array of really complicated objects and then quickly turn it into an array of objects that are much easier for me to work with. Okay, now maybe I don't want to show all the Pokemon. I really just want to show Pokemon that have, you know, C in their name, okay, or C is the first letter in their name. So that's where I might use filter. Okay, const filtered version. Okay, so now I'll take simple version dot filter, and I'll write a function again. We're just going to receive each individual Pokemon, and I'm going to just say, hey, you know, if Poke dot name dot split with an empty string, if the first letter of that doesn't equal C, then I don't want it. So essentially I'm saying, hey, so basically what I'm doing is I'm taking the name of the Pokemon, which is a string, splitting that string, and then calling the first item in that string, because it's an array of each letter. And I'm saying, hey, if that the first thing in that array, which is the first letter, isn't C, uppercase C, then I don't want it. Okay? So I've created a filtered list of Pokemon, console.log. So if I console.log the filtered version, okay, now I only have the 9 Pokemon that have this first name is C. So maybe those are the only Pokemon I want to display. Okay, so now I'm good to go display them. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that filtered version and then use the for each method. Okay, and then I have to just give that a function, which again, that function is going to receive each Pokemon. Again, it's just another callback method. Okay, and then in here I can go define what I want to do for each Pokemon. Which for that, what I'm going to want to do is, you know, append them to the DOM. So we'll just say const, we'll grab the main element, document.query selector main. So I'm going to grab the main element. Then I'm going to create a new element, const div equals document.create element. And then we'll create a div. Now I don't feel like doing a whole bunch of appends and whatnot to do everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say div.innerHTML equals, I'm going to use backticks, and that way I can define the HTML that I want inside that div. Okay, so I'm going to say, hey, inside that div, I want an H1. Actually, let's make it an H2. And inside that H2, using template literals, I can say, hey, I want inside this one, because again, I'm using for each. So I'm looping over each individual Pokemon, which is going to be in this variable called Poke. So Poke dot name. Okay, and then I'm going to have an image tag. And the source for that image tag, okay, is going to be poke.image. And then we're going to have an alt property for that tag, which is just going to be the Pokemon's name. Okay. Poke.name. And I'll just close the image tag. And then now all I have to do is append that div. So then I just say main.append div. And ta-da! Pokemon are now populated to my DOM. Okay? And again, this was not data that was on my computer. I called this data from some third-party computer. So imagine I'm calling weather from some third-party API and then making it show up on the page. So I'm getting the most up-to-date weather, making that appear on the page. Or the most up-to-date user data. Okay, I'm taking that data from a third-party source, which may pull it out from some database or wherever. It doesn't really matter. The backend handles that. All I care is I'm calling the API, and the API is getting me the data that I expected. And then I work with it to get the data that I want the way that I want it. So I take that big, because again, especially if you work with like a weather API, they give you really complicated objects. So I can, again, what did I do? I use map to take those objects and make them simpler with only the properties I plan on working with. Then I filtered out the ones I don't need using filter, and then I looped over them to append them to the DOM using for each. Okay, so here as you can see like why you're constantly working with APIs in web development. So here you can really see like I'm constantly working with these big arrays of objects. So these array methods are super, super useful when it comes to me working with data that I need to go put on the web page. So hopefully this makes it kind of clear, like, how all these things kind of fit together in the grander scheme of web development in JavaScript. So my name is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. Do make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the channel. Go head over to devnursery.com and you can, see a lot more video playlists. Same thing with Grok Overflow and all the other websites. They're all in the thumbnail. But otherwise, yeah, that's essentially the story. Okay. Um, and that's how that works. So hopefully this makes that clear. My name is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.com. Oh, not AlexMercedCoder.com because that's right, they stole my domain name. AlexMercedCoder.dev. Have a great day and make sure you subscribe to the podcast, Web Dev 101.